Today we are going to be making a watercolor landscape with birch trees and pine trees, a nice winter scene. I've got a few of them here that I've made in the past, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to start out by making a drawing talking about kind of how to balance your composition. Then we are going to make masks for our trees, paint the background color first, so the sky color. Second, we'll do the trees over the background color. Then we are going to do the foreground shadow areas. After that, we'll pull up the tape that we're using to mask off the trees and then paint the trees, branches, and any kind of sticks in the foreground that we might want to include. Now for this, you're going to be making your own composition. It might look like this. It might look like this. You might do it vertically in a portrait style composition as well. It's totally up to you, but I'm going to kind of do this step by step so that you can follow along. You'll want to have your sheet of watercolor paper. Mine is 7.5 inches tall by 11 inches wide. So that's the size you'll want to be working on if you want to follow along directly. Otherwise, you can make it whatever size you want. If you don't have that size watercolor paper, it should be a minimum of this size though to be able to get the detail you want to get. The next thing we're going to do before we begin drawing is we are going to tape down our paper. So I'm using this drafting tape. It's Intertape Polymer Group drafting tape. I got it from dickblick.com, but any kind of painter's tape will work too. This is the stuff I prefer to use because it's a little bit translucent, but this stuff will work good too, any of this edge lock painter's tape. So I'm going to quickly get this down, making sure to try to get it down as evenly as possible and have it overlap the paper by about 1/4 inch so that there's enough on the paper and enough on the surface you're sticking it to get it down nice and solid, making sure to really press down those edges where it meets especially. You can tape this to a sheet of cardboard, the back of a drawing pad if you want, or even something like a cutting board will work good too. But I like to use either a sheet of cardboard or board or the back of a larger drawing pad. Basically, you want something that's going to be flat and that's not going to get damaged if a little water leaks through. Like, you don't want to tape it down to your parents' nice wooden table in the kitchen. That would be bad. Okay, so we're nice and taped down. I double checked all of those edges really good to make sure. You can always push them down with the back of your paintbrush too. You'll want a large brush for this. You can even use a larger one than this if you'd like, and one that has a smaller or at least has a fine tip that you can do details with. You'll also want a cup for dirty water. That'll be the first cup you dip your water into, and then a cup for clean water, which is where you'll pull your water out of if you need to do like a clean water wash or anything. You'll also need a light pencil. So something that's not a really heavy lead. Mechanical pencil works good for this. You'll want either a blade or a pair of scissors for when we cut down our tape to make our masks. And you can have a sponge if you want, but you'll for sure want some paper towel to wipe your brush on, just to pull water out of it when we need it. Alternately, you can have a blow dryer if you want to be able to have your paint dry a little bit faster, like if you want to try to do this in one sitting. And then something like a nice cutting board for cutting out our masks is good. You can also use the back of a sketchbook if you want as well. So first things first, I'm going to make my composition. So I want to do this thing called following the rule of thirds. And this is something that we utilize a lot when we're talking about landscape and getting compositions to be nice. So that means parts of your composition should either take up 1/3 or 2/3 of your composition. You don't want things to be kind of really centered, right, and smack dab in the center, or take up two, half and half of the image. You kind of want to go for that 1/3, 2/3 rule. And this works if you're working portrait style as well. So if I were to be doing a landscape and this was my image, I wouldn't want to have, one tree here and the horizon up here. That wouldn't make for a very interesting image. It would be kind of unbalanced and not quite as flowing and interesting as the images I've already showed you. Alternately, if you were doing something portrait style, you wouldn't want to have kind of 1 or 2 trees right in the center. So you have your hills like this, and then your pine trees like all on one side. That wouldn't be a really good composition either, because everything is heavily weighted to one side. That's something you also want to think about with the composition, is how balanced it is. So with this one, I've got 1 tree and a lot of pine trees over here, and then on this side I have 2 birch trees and fewer pine trees. So they kind of balance it out. So you want to think about how your visual elements are going to balance each other out within your composition. So I'm going to start by drawing, and I'm just going to kind of stick 1 tree in and see how it balances within my composition. And if you feel uncomfortable doing this right on your paper, you can always start out on a piece of scrap computer paper or your sketchbook paper cut to the same size of this. That'll work good too, and then you can transfer the drawing down or put it up on a window where light is coming through and just trace it through lightly. This is also nice if you have a really heavy hand and you don't trust yourself to make light marks. When you're doing this, you do not want to have really dark marks, because the marks will show through your watercolor. You want to keep this as light as possible. You can even kind of erase it out. When you're erasing, you don't want to erase too hard because it can damage the surface of the watercolor paper. So kind of keep those things in mind. Mechanical pencil erasers are really nice. They don't tend to damage the paper, so they're what I recommend. So here's my first hill, and I'm going to kind of put 1 hill in the foreground and have it kind of curving a little bit. I don't want to do things like straight across either, because that tends to be less visually interesting. Maybe I might raise this hill a little bit more, and then maybe I will have the other 2 birch trees come out of this side. Make one a little spindly. And again, if you want to have a visual reference for this, so if you want to pull up some photographs of birch trees to look at when you're drawing these, you can if you feel more comfortable doing that. Another thing you want to avoid is a birch tree that goes right to the side of your image or kind of cuts off. So say this is my composition here. I don't want to have a birch tree that half of it's off the edge of the image like this either, because that's really hard to balance. Let's try to keep them mainly on. I don't need to see the top of them. They will go off the edge of the paper. So there's one, and then let's add another one right next to it, fairly close. So those guys can be pals over there. These guys are not social distancing. So I'm just going to adjust my image a little bit based on what I've got down. I might pull this guy over, and I'm just kind of going to imagine where the rest of my branches were going to be. These are the only ones I'm worried about drawing right now, because I'll put those branches in at the end. Okay, so I've got my drawing. I'm going to erase out some of these lines here. That's my foreground. Now I'm going to do another hill in the background here, and this one's going to kind of angle down and kind of meet the horizon right by this tree. You can kind of do this however you want. You just don't want it to be too extreme looking. Again, if you want to find an image you can use to visually reference, that's totally fine too. And then I'm going to add some pine trees in the background. So for this one, since there's going to be a lot more height here, I'm going to add my pine trees kind of coming up and balancing out that height here. I might just add a few over here. So these pine trees are going to be kind of behind the hills in this image. Maybe I'll heighten these just a little bit to match the height of that. It's up to you. You can kind of figure out what works and doesn't work visually. You can always change things up a little bit once you get your sky down. So now my next step is to mask off the trees. So I've got my composition. I'm really happy with it. I think it's going to work well. And now I want to mask off my trees because I want to be able to paint this background and not have to paint each section around the trees, because then it's going to look really uneven and non-cohesive. So I'm going to use my tape and just put it over the trees here, and I should be able to see my lines through it. If you're using a paint that's more opaque, that you can't see your lines through, what you can do is you can take a sheet of scrap paper, you can lay it down, trace out your tree, cut it out, and then use that to create a template on here with scissors. You can put your paper right over here, trace it out, and then cut it out with scissors if you need to. So that's another way to do it if you don't have transparent tape like what I have here. So I can kind of see my lines through this. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay down my paint or my tape over the top of it, and then I'm going to trace where I have my lines. And I'm going to do them a little bit taller so they can overlap that too. So I'm going to do this with all three. And then I'm going to put my tape down. I'm going to take it off of here, so I don't really want to press it down real hard right away. And then I'm going to take my tape off of this surface, attach it to either my cutting board or the back of my drawing pad, and I am going to create a template. So I'm going to do this one first so I can peel it off easily. Okay, go a little bit taller. Leave these two together. And then grab my cutting board. Again, I didn't put that tape down very hard because I want to be able to peel it up. That's the nice thing about this removable tape. And then I'm just going to cut this out with my X-Acto knife. I can also use scissors if I want to as well, but I find it a lot easier to do it with an X-Acto knife of some kind. You can use like a box cutter too, would work well for this. You just want something with a sharp edge. And then carefully peel off your tape. You might need to help it out a little bit. And you'll have a perfect mask for your form. You can use this when doing a lot of things. So say you're spray painting something and you don't want a certain shape to get painted. You can use this technique. You can even create larger areas of mask by just lining up sheets of tape together and putting them down. This technique works really, really good for any kind of watercolor and spray painting. Alternately, you can use this thing called liquid Frisket. It's a professional artist material, but it's kind of pricey and it tends to dry up after a few years. So I've really found that for the most part, if I'm masking large areas or nice distinct geometric forms like these ones, that tape works better for me. But you'll find what works for you personally. So anywhere where your tape had overlapped in your tree, make sure you press that down nice, and especially up towards those edges there, press it down nicely. So I'm going to complete these other two here. And then we'll move on to the background. All right, so now I'm really happy with how the trees are masked off. Everything is nice and attached, and I'm going to work on the sky. So my background, the hills, go up to this line here, and everything above that line I'm going to want to do in a wet and wet wash. So first, before I even start wetting the paper, I'm going to mix my colors. And I'm going to try to mix my colors instead of going straight out of the tub, because I think that you're going to get a lot more accurate colors that way. So that's something you'll always want to kind of keep in mind when you're working on landscape painting, is don't use the colors directly out of here. You'll want to match them to either your source or to something more natural. Okay, so what I'm talking about wetting is this area, even behind where I'm going to paint the pine trees, because the pine trees are darker in value and they are going to cover any of that blue. If my sky was orange, then the color would get skewed too much and maybe I would just paint up to the top of where the pine trees would be. But because the color is very similar, it's very close to blue on the color wheel, I'm not going to worry about painting underneath there. Same thing about these branches. These are going to come on way later. They're a darker value. They'll just go right over the top of the sky. So let's get started. I want to make sure my brush is really clean and that I have a paper towel on hand. And I'm going to use the clean water. So the first thing you'll want to do is mix up some color for your background. So I'm just going to use my large brush for this, or for your sky, and then I'm going to scoop in some of my pigment. And you'll need quite a bit of this to cover the whole sky. You don't want to skimp on only mixing a small amount. So I like to work in this bigger area here. And you'll want to have a piece of your sketchbook paper. You can cut it into little pieces like this to test it out, because it's going to look a lot darker in there than it will on the surface. And again, I like to mix this color because it's a little bit more natural. I like to stick a little bit of purple into my sky personally, because I think it gives a little bit of variegation and it's a little bit more accurate. And then just the tiniest bit of yellow I like to stick in there too. So I'm going to make that a little bit darker, because I can always add more water to it, but it's hard to remix your sky color once you start getting going on it. So I think I have about enough. Again, you want more as opposed to less. And then I'm going to rinse my brush out really good here. And the purpose of this is because I want to be able to get my background done with clean water. I don't want any of that blue to come through until I want to put it down there. And I want to work wet into wet. So I want to evenly wet this whole background with clean water. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go across as carefully as I can that horizon line, even behind my pine trees. And then I'm going to try to fill in this area above here as quickly as I can and as evenly as I can. And again, you'll kind of want to look at this from the side to make sure that you're not piling too much water up in one area. And you want to have your color mixed first before you add your water to your paper, because if you're trying to mix it after you've wet your surface, a lot of your surface is going to dry before you get that mixed. So mix it first and then wet your surface as evenly as possible. Again, if you start to see puddling, you can always kind of pull it out, use your brush, dry it out, and pull some of that area out so that you don't get giant puddles, because we're going to be adding more water to this. We just want that nice even sheen on the surface. Your surface might warp up just a little bit, the paper, as you're working on this. That's okay. We'll be able to flatten our paper later, but we're going for that even texture. And be careful of like areas in between here, because sometimes water tends to collect. So that's a pretty even surface sheen. You can see there's no big areas that are dripping off of there. So let's get our color down. I'm going to pull it right from here. I'm going to use my big brush again, and I'm going to go a little bit darker on the top. So I'm going to have this concentrated color first, and then I might add just a little bit of water and a little bit more blue to it as I go down. And I'm going to leave some areas, kind of the white of the paper, to kind of show cloud formations. So I'm going to work making big horizontal sweeping brush strokes, and I'm working horizontally with my lines instead of vertically because I don't want there to be a bunch of visible vertical lines. So if you think of clouds and stuff, they tend to be more kind of horizontal in nature. So I'm going to leave some of this white up here to look almost like a cloud. I might add another cloud kind of over here. You can kind of decide where you want them to be. You don't have to draw them out beforehand or plan too much of that. Again, working wet into wet. You don't want to fiddle around with this too long. You only have a little bit of time that this is open for. I'm going to pull a little bit more water into this. I like to add a little bit more of this blue towards the bottom of the horizon, but as you get closer to the horizon, sky tends to get a little bit lighter, especially during kind of the height of the day. So I'm going to pull that down so you can see it's getting a little bit lighter, but I don't want to leave it the white of the paper, so I want to bring that all the way down. Just kind of mix it together, and again, work quickly. I want to work while that paper is still nice and shiny. Once it starts to go matte in areas, you're done. Close it down. Don't try to work it out, or you'll get weird marks all over your painting that you might not want. Another thing you can do is you can add a little bit of clear water in to the cloud areas if you do want to get some of that cool granulation. So I'm just going to do that in a few little areas here, maybe a little bit over here. And that's going to kind of push out some of the paint from that area, so it'll kind of ploosh out in that direction as it dries. It'll look kind of neat. Okay, so I don't want to work this anymore. If I do, I'm going to get gross stripes all the way across it or too many visible brush strokes. I'm letting the water and the paper do its thing now. And at this point, you can either let it dry, take a little break, because we're going to be working on the pine trees next, or you can bust out your hair dryer and dry it off, which is what I'm going to do. So I'll be back in a few seconds. So my backdrop is now completely dry, and I can move on to my pine trees that I'm going to put back here. Now, you'll also want to mix this color, because if you use the straight up green in here, it's actually pretty unnatural. So how do we tone that down to look more like this green, like an actual pine tree? We're going to use the complementary color to do this. So first let's load up one of these pans with some water. And again, you'll want a pretty good amount of this. You can also use a water droplet if this is going too slow for you. And I'm going to scoop up a good chunk of green paint here. Might have a little bit too much water in there. I'll pull some of that out. Let's test that out again. Use a piece of your sketchbook paper to do this so you can see what it'll actually look like. Need a little bit more green there. So now, to kill some of that saturation and that brightness, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of the complements or split complements of green. I'm going to start out by adding a little bit of this orange. So you can see how that instantly kind of neutralizes some of that saturation. I'm going to add a little bit of red too. Might seem kind of counterintuitive, but remember when we add those complementary colors, they tend to neutralize the saturation and darken it. So that's looking a little bit darker, but I'm going to add just a very tiny amount of black to that. To kind of see how that looks. And that's looking pretty good. I still think I need a little bit more of all the colors combined just to get it dark enough and thick enough for what I want to lay down. And I want to, again, make sure I have a good amount of this mixed up so that when I go to lay it down, I'm not having to remix it halfway through. All right, that's looking pretty great. So I have here the area that I want to put this down in. And when I'm making pine trees, I want to think about kind of the movement of the pine tree. So I don't want to see like total, you know, super consistent looking marks or a pine tree that looks like this. What I want to see is mark making that either kind of emulates a little bit of the weight of those pine boughs or is a little bit more organic in nature. So the first thing I want to do when I'm doing these is I want to work kind of from the bottom up. That kind of helps me because that bottom line I think is the trickiest. I want to work along the horizon line. And if you're really nervous about this, you could also put an extra piece of tape over the top of it, but I like to live life on the edge, so I'm just going to kind of go right along that first, just using the very tip of my brush here. So you can see I'm kind of emulating that pine tree bough or branch. Mixing just a slight variation so I can kind of pop it in there as I need to. And again, going along that bottom edge first, and then kind of building up from that. You can do it kind of like a couple inches at a time. That tends to work the best for me. But yeah, making sure that's nice and thick, because it'll dry a little bit lighter than what's coming down on here, just like our tempera paint does. And you can vary the horizon or the top edge of where the trees are as well. Again, getting that horizon line and then working up from there. All right, I think those are looking pretty good, and you can paint right over that tape. It's not a big deal because it will, the tape will block that off as you move. So I'm going to do this side, and I might do this side just a slight bit lighter. So I'll just use this side that I mixed up just to kind of show that atmospheric perspective that we've talked about, or that sense that as elements are further away from us, they might get a little bit lighter. Might also do slightly smaller brush strokes to kind of show that this area is a little bit further in the background as well. I'm going to pull along that horizon line. And then fill in that space in between. And again, if you didn't wait long enough to do this, what's going to happen is your green's going to kind of meld into your sky, which is kind of what you don't want. If you run into an issue where your trees dry a little bit lighter than what you want, you can always let them dry fully and then bring another layer of paint right over the top of that. It won't hurt them. It'll actually give a little bit more visual texture, which could be nice too. Okay, again, I'm gonna let that dry and then move on to our next step, which will be to get some of these shadows in the foreground. So our next step is going to be to get these shadows in the foreground area like I've got here. So my pine trees are dry and I am ready to go. So what I'm looking to do is create a color that's similar to this but maybe a little bit more gray, just to show that depth of some areas going back into space and others going forward. I also might want to show a little bit of cast shadow from my trees. For this image, I'm going to say the light is coming from this direction, so this side of my trees are going to be lighter and this side is going to be darker, and therefore we'll see a cast shadow that way and some shadows behind here. So I'm just going to go ahead and really lightly kind of sketch in where I want my shadows to be. You don't necessarily have to do this. You can do this as you're going to. And I'm going to slowly kind of erase out some of those lines around my trees because I've already got the tape there, so I can get rid of any of those. Okay, so we've got our background done, and now we're working on our foreground. So like I said before, with watercolor, you want to work from background to foreground and light to dark. So I'm just going to reactivate some of this blue that I'd already made. I like to call watercolor zombie paint because you can reanimate it once it dries up, which is fun. And then before I put it down right on my paper, I'm going to test this out just to see what it's going to look like. And that might be just a little bit dark, so I'm going to add just a little bit more water to that before I put it down. I like to use a large brush for this, but if you feel more comfortable using a small brush, that should be okay for this too. I'm going to start out by going along this line here. I'm going to go right over my tree and kind of pretend it's not there because I've got that blocking off. And then I can use my paper towel to just pull some of the water off, put a little bit of clean water in, and I'm just going to kind of put that clean water right above there, and that's going to kind of blur that edge. So that's a really nice technique you can use too. And then I'm going to kind of paint wet into wet right along this horizon line. I might bring in a little bit of shadow kind of towards the back of there as well. And now I'm going to establish some of the shadow behind the trees here. So I'm going to use almost a dry brush technique where I'm just kind of making a little divot around the tree and then pulling off to the side. Same thing here and here. So that can be a pretty quick little flick. And if it's not perfect, you can always blot it up or put some water on it and blot it up, let it dry and do it again. So if you mess up, it's pretty forgiving with the lighter colors. You can always use your paper towel to pull it off. And then I might kind of go back into those and lay in just a little bit of darker paint really close by that stump. Now this area is kind of empty in here. One thing I might do instead of having this vast white area is maybe there's a tree off to the side here that's casting a shadow, or maybe there's just a divot in the snow. We can kind of make anything up that we want. So I'm just gonna pull my brush, that dry brush technique, and just add a little bit of blue towards the bottom. It's kind of up to you. You can add things in here and there if you'd like. Might also knock a little bit of blue right towards the horizon there, just to kind of pull that back in space a little bit. Maybe I'll put some in this corner a little bit too. Alright, so now it's really feeling like there's a sense of space in this landscape as well. One thing you do have to be careful of is getting close to these pine trees. You can always do the background and foreground first, and then the pine trees third if you want to too. You can switch the order if you're worried about blending in. If they do kind of blend in like they have a little bit here, you can always lift that paint right towards the edge or blot it out a little bit and go back in with the green and reestablish it if you want. Okay, I'm going to pop just a little bit more shadow around these. Sometimes as it dries, it'll lighten a little bit. So with this, since it's kind of a little bit more organic, you can always add a few more brush strokes. Those dry brush strokes in here can be kind of pretty and add a little bit of visual interest. Okay, so I've got my foreground done. Now I'm going to let that dry again and move on to the next part. All right, now that our foreground is mostly dry, what I'm going to do is pull off these, and we can get to see our really lovely tree branches underneath here. Or our tree trunks, I should say. And this is actually what we will be painting next, is our tree trunks. And we're going to use a wet and wet technique first to establish the light and shadow areas within these. And then we're going to go over that with more detail. So these are actually 2 layers. But I'm going to start out by just erasing out any pencil lines that might be remaining within my drawing. And again, you'll want to use a soft pencil and make sure your painting is fully dry before doing this. Okay, my light is coming from the right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first mix up my color for my trunk. I'm going to clean out this pan here so I have a clean space to work in. And a birch tree trunk is not like your typical, oops, too much paint there. It's not your typical brown, right? That's more like a oak tree trunk. And you don't want to go with the generic color right out of there because it's going to look a little bit hokey if you do. So you want to make sure that you're mixing a color for this. So birch tree trunks tend to be more of a grayish brown. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of brown and a little bit of black. And that's super dark, right? So we want to pull that a lot lighter. And I think that's a good shadow color. As you add more water to it, it's going to be a good lighter color. So for this, we'll want to start out by covering our entire tree trunk with water. And then we're going to place our mixed color onto the left-hand side of our tree because the light's coming from the right-hand side to create a nice softened shading effect. So I'm going to make sure my water's super clean. I'll start off with this one. And I'm going to work quickly for this. I want to be pretty exact and get into that, just all that white area that we had covered before. I want to make sure this is pretty even. So these skinny areas tend to dry up pretty quickly. So you'll want to have your color mixed before you go into it with your water, like usual. Okay. So I'm going to pull a little bit onto that onto my brush, and I do one tree at a time. It's kind of impossible to do them more than that. And you'll notice that when I lift up my brush, it creates a little blob like that, which actually looks a lot like the normal kind of color variation that happens on a birch tree. Birch trees are those ones that are white on the trunks with black striations. So that's what we're trying to create the look of. And as the branches get further from the tree, they actually turn more of a solid brown. So that'll be a fun thing to recreate as we go. So I'm just going to pop that a little bit more brown because that's kind of behind there. And I might kind of just do a few more little details while this is wet. And then I'm going to wait for it to dry and do another layer of detail over the top where I'll get more of those more distinct shapes. So again, I want to make sure that my brush is nice and clean for moving on to these next ones, but I'll do these other two the same exact way. I'll start off with clear water, and then I'll add that shading to the left-hand side. For this next part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same paint color, and I'm going to show some of the striations or markings on the birch tree. So I might add things like little detail lines that go across, Again, if you haven't seen birch trees or you want a little bit of a visual reference other than this image, feel free to Google them. But the important thing is when you're doing these is if this is the edges of your trees, you don't want to go straight across like this because it'll make it look like it has no dimension. What you want to do is kind of make those C-shaped markings along there to show that volume of the tree. You can also do things like make little holes like where branches kind of fell off, or markings across there, or even just some variations other than that. So I'm going to make a little kind of hole along this one. I'll make another one up here. I'm going to make these marks a little bit darker on the left-hand side of the tree than I might on the right-hand side of the tree, just because that's where the light will come along. So I tend to do one side of the tree first and then move on to the other. Again, I'm trying to be mindful of the shape of the branches and the trunk as I'm making these marks. I don't want to go totally horizontal with my mark making. So I'm going to do all the dark sides first and then I'll move on to the light sides. I'm using the very tip of my brush too because that's where you'll get the most detail. If you're pressing down hard, you might get bigger marks than what you want to get. Sometimes I'll even reestablish a little bit that edge by having a little bit of darker value along there as well. But you can see this adds a nice little sense of depth and detail within your painting. And if you're doing this and you feel like it's drying too light, you can always let it dry and go over it with another layer. That'll work really nicely with this. So now I'm going to do the lighter sides. I'm going to add a little bit of water to lighten that up. And I'm going to do just a little fewer marks on this side, I think, because it'll read nicely that it's a little bit lighter on this side. Sometimes in light areas I'll kind of reestablish the edge there too. Okay, I think it's looking pretty good. My birch trees are looking very birchy. I might just take a little bit of black, mix it into here, and just pop just a few little areas just a little bit darker, just to add even more of a sense of depth. Just a few little spots. I'm not going crazy with this. Okay, there we go. Now it's time for the fun part, I think anyways, which is the branches. And for these, you'll want to mix a similar color to what we were just using, a nice grayish brown. And for the leaf, or for the branches, we want to kind of think about the shape of tree branches as they move out from the tree. So for this, I'm starting out pressing down a little bit harder, and then I'm going to slowly lift the brush and apply less pressure as I move further away from the tree. That'll give that sense that the brush or that the branch is getting a little bit smaller. And I want to really look at kind of trees and how they are in nature. If I am making my tree branches, I don't want them to look like this, because that's not how they look in nature. I want you to kind of really follow that organic form. If you again need a visual reference just to get an idea of the flow and the feeling of those forms, you can pull one up. So they should end up looking like this when they're done. So I'm going to add just a little bit more water to mine because I think it's just a little bit dark, and then I'll just start. I want to think about, you know, how and where they're going to move out from space. I don't want to start them from way down there. I start them from a little bit higher up on the tree first, and they're going to kind of go on and off the page. So I start them from the base or their trunk, and then I move out from there. And they can go in front of or behind the tree. You want to vary it up. Another thing I like to do when I make these branches is sometimes as I get further out, I like to add a little bit of water to my brush so they actually get a little bit lighter in value too. This kind of just helps them dissipate into space and feel like they're not quite as heavy as some of these branches that are a little bit larger as they come closer to the tree. So that's another technique you can use too. But yep, you'll want to, you know, just use a dry brush right on your paper. You don't need to plan these out too much. If you are feeling really nervous about this, you could kind of draw a few out in pencil as a guide really, really lightly. But it will be harder to kind of erase them once they're down. So you're kind of stuck either way. So I like to just jump into it. So that one's looking pretty good. I might just add a few more kind of vertical, maybe one overlaps from this side, branches. And then I'm going to move over to here. I might not show quite as much of the branches over here. They might go a little bit higher up off of the page for me, because I think this side is already pretty visually heavy. So and if it's hard for you to work like chunkier to lighter, you can always, you know, start from the outside, work lighter, and then get darker as you work towards it. These branches can intermingle too. They don't need to kind of butt right up to one another. You can always thicken a few of them up as well. Just kind of take a few seconds every now and then and take a look at them, even back up further from your drawing and decide, oh, do I need more, or should I, you know, parse it down and just let it be the way I have it. So I think this is pretty good. Maybe I'll add one more little half branch sticking out of here. Like he's waving to his friends. Hey, how's it going? And I feel like my branches are good. So I'm ready to move on to my last step, which is just adding a little bit of texture and grass around the base of these trees. This will kind of let them have a little bit more grounding and not feeling like they're kind of floating out of nowhere. So I'm going to use that same grayish brown, and I'm just going to use the littlest tip of my brush here. Just add, you know, like some broken sticks or some grasses that are just kind of coming out around the base of the tree where there's a little bit of gap in the snow. You know, maybe there's a few stray pieces in the foreground here too, just some little scraggly pieces of grass that are bumping through the snow, or maybe some sticks that have fallen down. Okay, I think we are almost ready. To go. So that's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. And your last and final step is to pull off your tape, which is, I think, the most fun step. So again, make sure you do this slowly, and after your painting is fully dry, if you try to rip off the paint while it's still wet, it will tear your paper, which will not be good. And if your painting does warp a little bit, most of the time it will. One thing that you can do, if you're needing to photograph it afterwards or frame it, is you can wet the back of it evenly. So I would take something like a clean sponge, flip it over, wet the back of it, not too saturated, not like we're doing a wet and wet wash, but just to dampen the whole back of it. Then I would set it down on something absorbent like this paperboard pad, stick a piece of cardboard or a sketchbook that's larger than this over the top of it, so something that's cardboard and smooth, and then put heavy weights on top of that. And if you leave that overnight, it'll be totally flattened by the morning, and you'll be able to photograph it nice and easily. Okay, so I hope you guys had fun and enjoyed making this painting.